Welcome, viewers and listeners, to another edition of CHP Talks. I'm here with one of our favorite guests of all time, Mr. Brian Peckford. Brian, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
And for those who may not have been around when we had our last interviews, Brian Peckford has been a great leader in some of the challenges or challenging what's been going on as our rights and freedoms have been eaten away at by its federal government. But a little bit about him. He's the former Premier of Newfoundland. He was born in Whitburn, Newfoundland. And at the age of 29, Brian was elected the first progressive conservative member of the House of Assembly of Newfoundland. He served as Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Minister of Mines and Energy, and also Minister of Rural Development and Northern Affairs. In March 1979, Brian became the third Premier of the province since Confederation. At 36, he was the youngest First Minister of Newfoundland since the first Prime Minister, Philip Little, in 1855. As Premier, Brian was a strong advocate of provincial rights, as manifested in his efforts to gain some control of and revenues for the province from the developing offshore oil and gas resources, culminating in the Atlantic Accord. Many of you will remember that. Brian was also involved in the constitutional patriation process of the early 1980s, leading to the Constitution Act of 1982 and our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which has been so sadly neglected or abused by some in power. It was Newfoundland's proposal that led to the breakthrough. Brian is the only living First Minister of that constitutional process. And Brian, I think I will just leave it there. There's so much more that could be said about what you've done since then, but want to welcome you again to CHP Talks, and I know you've got something important to share with the folks here today.
Yeah, well, thanks a million for having me. I really appreciate it, and giving me a chance, a vehicle through which I can express my views.
Yeah.
As a lot of your...
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. What caught my attention in the last week, I do read many of your blog posts, and for those who haven't been there, Peckford 42 Peckford42.wordpress.com is Mr. Peckford's blog, and it's full of a lot of good information. But I'm not sure how long ago it was, a week or 10 days ago, I saw that you had written about the Supreme Court giving a very unsatisfactory, very disappointing refusal to hear your case, which is a very important case. So that said, in my mind, I said, we've got to have you on and speak to our people again about what has gone on in the Supreme Court and why that is such a dangerous signal to us in a Western democracy like Canada.
Yeah, well, this was the final appeal by myself and several other Canadians who were part of the statement of claim. And it started almost 2 years ago when we challenged the federal government's travel mandate during the COVID period. And we challenged it under the Charter, which protected our mobility rights. And what the travel mandate was doing was restricting anybody who did not have a vaccination, a COVID vaccination, from traveling anywhere in Canada or to leave Canada. And of course, this affected almost 6 million Canadians. So almost 6 million Canadians that did not get vaccinated. And so we were representing all of the unvaccinated, if you will, in this kind of effort. And so our appeal was to the Federal Court of Canada. That's the first court that this would apply to for us to appeal. So we laid a statement of claim through our lawyers in the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, saying that the travel mandate was unconstitutional because it violated our mobility rights as protected under the Charter. The federal court finally sort of listened to our case, but then ruled that they wouldn't rule. They ruled that the whole thing, by the time it was heard, the travel mandate had been lifted. And so the 8 or 10 months that the travel mandate was in effect was no longer there, and therefore it was all, as they called it, in their own creative technicality, moot. It was all moot. It wasn't relevant anymore. As if the rights and freedoms of almost 6 million Canadians, it didn't matter whether they were violated for those 7 or 8 or 10 months. One of the people who were part of our lawsuit, besides Maxime Bernier, leader of the People's Party of Canada, was a person, for example, who had a business in Yellowknife as well as one in Toronto, and he lived in the Toronto area. And now he couldn't get back and forth to conduct his business in Yellowknife, for example. So it affected him financially and economically. Others who were part of it were people who couldn't go and visit their relatives or their family who were dying or sick or whatever. And so we thought that the Transport Canada's bringing in this travel mandate was unconstitutional. And the federal court therefore just decided that they wouldn't hear it. You know, we heard it in the sense, but we're not going to rule on because it's all moot now. So we're not going to rule on. So we had to accept that, and then we appealed that to the Federal Court of Appeal, the next level.
Right. And
the Federal Court of Appeal confirmed the federal court's decision. We're not going to hear it either. It's all moot, and there's no concern anymore. And I'm still very angry about all that, because they start put time limits on when a court or when the state is going to determine whether your rights were violated or not by a government action. And the right to know. I mean, basic to every democracy is a citizen's right to know about what the government is doing to them, and whether it's constitutional or not, or whether it's legal or not. You have a right to know. I'll never forget reading Hannah Arendt's book, The Origin of Totalitarianism, through this period, and where she, halfway through her book, was talking about a group of people and how, I think it was to deal with some of the people in Romania, the roaming people, the Roma people, and where she was advocating and saying, you know, how these people didn't have a right to know. They were no longer citizens of the country because they had no rights. They had no rights to know where they stood. And that right to know has always stood with me for a long while. So the Supreme Court takes it on and does the same thing. Says, we agree with the Federal Court of Appeal, we agree with the federal court, and now we're rid of it. And it's taken up too much time. I mean, this was said in the courts going through. It was taking up too much of their time. This is time of that's what the court was established for, but to determine whether the rights and freedoms of individuals under the Constitution were violated or not.
Right.
It had nothing to do with time frames. There's nothing in the Constitution or in the mobility clause of the Charter of Rights talking about time frames, whether your rights were violated or not at any time. Yeah. So I'm very upset with that. And but now we're at a point where we have no other recourse. That's the final recourse. And so it's over and done with. Sadly, this is the 7th time that the Supreme Court of Canada has denied an appeal on our charter. The 7th time. The first time, by the way, or one of the first times, was Sheila Lewis, the lady in Alberta who couldn't get a transplant because she was unvaccinated. And that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they denied hearing the case and allowed the original decisions to stand. And she's dead now.
Yeah. Are these seven times when they've denied, refused to listen to a case, have they all been since the COVID?
Yes,
So, so
yes.
this is a new
This is
situation.
well, especially to the extent that they're gone. So
Yeah.
that was Sheila Lewis. Then there was the Gateway Bible Church versus Manitoba. Once again, denied, wouldn't even hear it. And that case, by the way, had as its expert witness Dr. J. Bhattacharya.
Wow.
And then there was, the next one was a Baudouin versus the Attorney General of BC, which was a BC lockdown church case, denied hearing it, let the original decision stand, in other words. Then there was a Trinity Bible versus Ontario case, which was another church lockdown case. And then, of course, the one before mine that got decided was Jordan Peterson, where they denied to hear an appeal by him about his rights from the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Ontario. So now it's my case with 4 or 5 other Canadians who joined in with me on it. And so now we're waiting to hear what the costs will be. While the Justice Centre has took my case and is covering a lot of the costs and have raised money for that purpose, there is still a cost of the court itself through the process. And because we lost and they awarded costs against us, we will, our 6 or 7 of us, however many it was, I think it's 7 of us, will have to divvy up based upon that our share of the costs of hearing that in our court.
Wow, the cost that you actually have to bear the financial cost of this court failure or this court refusal to do justice. I'm going to call it a refusal to do justice because they
the majority of the money will be paid for by the Justice Centre, but the actual time that the court took will be calculated by the court, not by an independent group, of what their costs were, and that cost we will have to bear. The rest of the lawyers' costs are going to be taken care of by the Justice Centre.
Yeah. How about costs from the government side that you were seeking justice in terms of the unjust regulations that they imposed?
Well, there's nothing on that. I mean,
no, okay,
nothing on that at all. And they give no reasons, of course. The Supreme Court of Canada, when it denies to hear something that was appealed to them from a lower court, are not obligated to provide reasons. So what it means is that the reasons from the previous court decision stands. So if you get into an argument with somebody over, well, they didn't even provide reasons, the people on the government side would say, yes, the reasons already given by the 2 lower courts stand. So that's their argument.
This mootness is a very tricky business because, number one, as you pointed out, I think in your appeal, or at least commentary on it, if they lifted the restriction, but they could impose it again at any time. So,
exactly.
In other words, they have not been told that they are forbidden to interfere with people's mobility. So if they decide to do it again, all of a sudden, theoretically, the mootness is gone, but who's going to be in a position to mount that case again? And
even if you do mount it, by the time you get mounted, the government will watch to see where it is in the court system, then take away the regulation again, so that by the time it's heard, it's moot again.
Yeah.
So you can repeat this over and over again.
Yeah.
The other point that your viewers may be very interested in, which doesn't get carried when anybody talks about this case, is this. And where I thought the Supreme Court of Canada would enter the fray. not only from the point of view of right to know, but this. It came out in the federal court hearing, in the original court hearing, that the government of Canada had no scientific evidence on which they based the travel ban. This came out in court. One of our lawyers, Keith Wilson, who was questioning the federal government's representatives, admitted they didn't have any scientific medical information on which to base the travel ban. So I thought that the Supreme Court judges, in reviewing the cases, which they're obligated to do when reviewing the arguments, that they would have picked up on this and saw and said, oh my gosh, so this whole thing is based upon nothing. There's no medical reason for doing what they did and taking away people's rights for 8 or 10 months, 5 million Canadians. So I thought that at the end of the day, the Supreme Court would say, we need to hear this. We need to review this. We need to go through this carefully and give both sides a chance to make that argument. Wasn't there medical evidence available? No, there was not. And this was admitted at the federal court hearing. So this is the sad, tragic part about it, that the whole thing, number one, was based upon a moot argument that the court created. Wasn't created by the Constitution. The court created themselves. And two, to make that decision and leave the original court decisions to stand means that the Supreme Court is endorsing an action by the government, which was allegedly on medical scientific grounds, for which no evidence was provided by the government.
Yeah, and as one of the signatories of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Constitution Act 1982, you've pointed out many times that when the government, there are cases where the government can interfere, but it has to be reasonably justified. You know the wording.
Yeah, exactly. Demonstrably justified. And nowhere was this demonstrably justified.
Yeah. So
and those words are right in the Charter, Section 1 of the Charter.
And wouldn't you think that the Supreme Court, its primary duty is to defend the Charter and keep the integrity of the Charter as it's enforced upon the Canadian people, and to hold the government in check? The Charter is there for us, not for the government.
Exactly.
The Charter is there to
and the court is supposed to be there for the people. Yeah. That's the whole idea. It's individual rights and freedoms. That's what the Charter is all about. That's why it was brought in the first place. And so this is a very sad day for democracy. And obviously, our democracy, from a freedom of speech and individual rights and freedoms point of view, is lost, is gone. And whether we'll ever get it back again, as I cite those other 6 cases plus my case, is an open question. Looking at where things are going today, the chances of us restoring our democracy and our Charter and having these rights and freedoms restored to the individual Canadian is very remote indeed. And so we reached the pinnacle of our democracy several years ago, and ever since then it's been downhill. Yeah,
no, I agree with you. And we look at even, in the political realm, we will have, at least we expect we will have an election within the next year or so, and maybe sooner than later, depending on Jagmeet Singh. But the reality is that our Prime Minister has appointed 85 of the senators that are currently sitting in the Senate of Canada. So if you're going to pass legislation that would turn back some of these abuses of the government, or to try to undo some of the legislation that the government has passed, now you've got to run a gauntlet of 85 senators.
Yes, but I agree. But before that, the legislation has to come to them. And
Yeah.
it has to come from the House of Commons, which are elected people.
Yeah.
And you're not going to see any, even under any new conservative government, any change in that. That's the problem. If there was some hope that the Conservative Party of Canada was going to stand up for the Charter and bring in some legislation and force the Senate to make a decision on, that would be one thing. But we're not even going to get any legislation out of the House of Commons. So the 85 senators or however many, some of them are allegedly independent, but how they vote on a given matter is an open question. But they're not even going to be forced to decide, because they're not going to have anything coming before them from the House of Commons.
Yeah, bold legislation.
See, this is the problem. People get diverted to the Senate when they should stick with the House of Commons, which are elected people. And that's where our problem is with our own elected people.
Right, yeah.
Now, Poilievre has never said anything about moving to have a parliamentary inquiry on the COVID lockdowns. He said nothing about bringing in legislation, right, to do something about these decisions of the Supreme Court. They're not going to touch that with a 40-foot pole.
Yeah.
So we're left, and to show just how defunct our democracy is now, Rod, the NDP have broken their agreement with the Liberals. So the Liberals are now in a completely legitimate minority situation. In other words, they don't have a majority of the MPs. However, who comes up and fills the void from the NDP? The Bloc from Quebec. So the Bloc are saying now, the leaders come out and said yesterday and today, we're here. We're prepared to do a deal with the Liberals if they agree to give Quebec A, B, and C. We're here to defend Quebec. We're not here to defend Canada. And we're prepared to do a deal. What's going to happen now? So this is the state of our democracy, that you've got the tail wagging the dog. First it was the NDP, and now both minority, and now the Bloc just from Quebec, wagging the tail wagging the dog again. So this is just how sad it is. And have I read or seen anybody coming out, any of the big national leaders attacking the Bloc leader for making these kinds of ridiculous statements of further dividing Canada? Because what he will do if he doesn't get his way, he will go back to Quebec and say, the federal government doesn't work for us, and you've got to vote more and more seats for us in the next election.
Yeah.
And he'll attack the rest of the federal government as being against Quebec, and that further divides Canada.
Well, this government we have, I include the NDP and the Bloc and some of the Conservatives in this, but certainly the Liberals and their supporters, they have been dividing the country based on gender, based on ethnic background, based on all kinds of things, religious claims. Prime Minister taking a run at Christians every once in a while, saying they're the worst kind of Canadians and whatever. And he doesn't seem to mind dividing people. It seems to think his kingdom rests on having a country in chaos, poverty-stricken, in chaos, in debt, and all angry about something, right? And
he's become very secular, non-Christian, non-religious, to the point where, and by the way, none of the lawyers that I have my own sort of mailing list, and I mail out some of my blogs and stuff to quite a few lawyers. And there's always this, I know several of them who are on my side, but in this latest effort, usually a number of them will get back to me supporting what I'm doing, but none got back this time.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
None got back this time. And the other point from a Christian spiritual point of view is that the courts and the governments and the parties and all the political parties have not defended the supremacy of God and the rule of law, which is part one, first section of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Exactly.
So I did an update to my Magna Carta that I gave down in the university, down at the Victoria in 2022. And this year I spoke down there again, and I updated it and enlarged it, and I put it on my blog, and I sent it out to a lot of people. I suspect I sent it to you as well, where I enlarged about it and brought in this whole supremacy of God and rule of law, and brought in when the Charter came in, when the Constitution Act came in, and how even at that point in time, there were people opposing how that happened and tried to diminish Newfoundland's role and my role in it, and have been doing so ever since. And if most Canadians go online today, they will find that anything that I had to do with it or Newfoundland government had to do at the time has been eliminated. Wow. And they just talk about 3 attorneys general who scribbled some stuff on a piece of paper at Chateau Laurier Hotel, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Chrétien, and that it was those scribbles on that piece of paper which changed the situation on that last day of the conference, when none of us ever saw these pieces of paper, saw this piece of paper. Mine was a document that I produced, and that is in my book. Right. The document is there. It was presented to all the first ministers, and I have copies of it, and I have the copies in my book, and everybody knows this. Everybody knows that this was the document. Even the Prime Minister himself, who was opposed to me, Justin's father, admitted that to the press after the deal was done. Yeah. And we still have all of this going on, and now the supremacy of God is gone. The book 1984 which is so prescient in terms of some of the things that are happening today. It was written long before the actual year of 1984, but one of the things there was how they would change history, and they would they would redo things if it was no longer convenient to believe a particular thing. They would take out all the documents, redo them, and all of a sudden people would believe a different history. Yeah. See, we've gotten away from where like a lot of the Americans still are. Here's one of the best books, recent books that come out. It's entitled The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage, by Professor Jonathan Turley of the George Washington University Law School. He's a very, very eminent scholar, constitutional scholar, and he goes through all this business of natural rights, right? Okay. And in the United States, there's still hundreds of lawyers and professors who are very much on the side of the supremacy of God and the natural rights of individuals as human beings. Yes, yeah. They're bestowed, right, by God with natural rights. And that's this whole business of freedom. That's where the Constitution of the United States comes from. Yeah, it's from that, right? And so, and a lot of lawyers don't even know in Canada that there's a university in the United States, San Diego University, which has a huge big section on originalism, right? That's the division of originalism. Okay. And hundreds of lawyers who are in different other universities and who are practicing and advocating what you and I are advocating. They're still doing it, and you can go in on that site today and find all of these professors of eminent, brilliant scholars who are very much in favor of interpreting the Constitution as it was originally written. Yeah. And if there's to be changes, there's an amending formula for changing. What Canadians don't seem to realize that one of the big blessings of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was not just to write down what our individual rights and freedoms was to establish for the first time an amending formula by which we could change our constitution in Canada.
Yeah, yeah.
From 1927 to 1982, there were 10 times when Canada tried to bring back its constitution so that we'd have an amending formula in Canada. And 9 times it failed.
Wow.
And it was the 1982 when it succeeded, because the 9 times it failed, the provinces and the federal government couldn't agree on an amending formula. And now we have an amending formula. So there is a process by which change can happen, but people are ignoring that. Right?
Well, both the Prime Minister, our current Prime Minister, his cabinet, and the Supreme Court itself, sadly, instead of amending the Constitution, they just ignore it. They ignore these basic concepts of supremacy of God and the rule of law. That whole thing is based on that there is
and that's right in the Constitution. There's a lot of people, because the lawyers keep calling it a preamble.
Yeah.
They keep referring to, I won't refer to it as a preamble. We didn't. The authors of that did not.
Okay.
We never referred to it as a preamble. There's no word preamble there. It's part 1. It just said, whereas this country was founded, right, on the principles of the supremacy of God and the rule of law.
Yeah.
Colon. I remember talking to you about this before. Colon. In other words, everything comes after that.
Exactly. It's all based on that.
And it's all right there. It's right there in black and white.
Yeah.
And so the lawyers who talk about preamble are trying to use that so people get the idea this came before the charter, right? Preamble came before. No. We never call it preamble. This is part of the charter. This is part 1 of the charter.
Yeah, yeah. And so all those things that are being ignored, the rule of law, of course, which to me, the primary meaning of the rule of law is that everybody is judged equally according to the same principles, that there's no favoritism and whatever. And that, of course, is being ignored dramatically.
All over the place.
Yeah.
All over the place. I think it's Section 50 of the Charter. Every Canadian, every citizen is equal before the law.
Yeah.
And that's been totally ignored.
Yeah.
So here we are in a very bad situation, and facing a provincial election of a government that is blatantly, the NDP government of BC has blatantly violated the Constitution, has spent has spent the province into debt.
Yeah.
That it's very difficult we'll ever get out of it, or even get out of getting a deficit, even balancing our budget any 1 year now.
Right.
It's very difficult.
Yeah.
And the same way now federally. And so we're not only morally corrupt, we're also financially corrupt.
Yeah.
And that's why the country is going down. That's why our democracy is going to fail. And with it, our ability to finance ourselves.
Yeah. And I think there's a direct correlation, and I'm sure you agree, between ignoring the supremacy of God and having a workable financial, economic.
Absolutely. When there's no moral code,
yeah.
I know that from a teacher. If you don't set the rules of the game at the beginning of the year, and the students get the idea that they can almost do what they want, then that's what they will do. But if you set the rules down and you enforce them as written, as defined, then you have some structure and you have some accountability and transparency, which will lead to more responsible, sensible government.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Brian, I appreciate so much you taking the time to be with our viewers and listeners, to spend time with us, explaining the situation. I'm terribly disappointed with you about this decision of the Supreme Court, the decision not to decide, not to even listen to the arguments. Is well, there's a real. I mean, we know we're going downhill if the Supreme Court will not exercise justice on behalf of the people of Canada.
Yeah, and we can change that. We can change that, you see. The way the Constitution is set up and how the courts act is all part of legislation. so that the government, the parties in power, the political parties can amend, as I've mentioned in my Magna Carta, can amend the Judicature Act, and how the not only the senators are part of the Constitution, but the courts are not. The courts are not. The courts came after and were created by laws, right? And therefore, the governments have the opportunity to change the way judges are appointed and how decisions are made. For example, I say in my Magna Carta that we should pass a law in the Parliament of Canada that all decisions of the court that involve the charter, they will be forced to deal with the supremacy of God and the rule of law in their decision before moving on to make a final decision on it. They should be forced to have to deal with those situations. And governments can do that if they wanted to. Governments can do that in the same way as that we can stop MPs from being MPs if they broke the law. Right now, they can break the law and still sit in Parliament. Yeah. And we can change that. We don't need to change the Constitution. We can do it in our Parliament.
Right. Well, let's hope that we have voices in the Parliament next year, maybe not all from one party, but good men and women who acknowledge the supremacy of God and the rule of law, who will exercise their not only their authority but their responsibility.
Yes,
take it seriously, not just think about their increased salary.
Well, I don't know where they are. I haven't found any.
Yeah,
I haven't found any.
Well,
during the COVID period, there were a lot of MLAs and MPs that came after me to do a sort of like a seminar for them, briefing on my position on the Constitution and what happened in 1981, 82 when we got the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and I did. And I was absolutely flabbergasted. Most of them had no idea, had never read the Constitution Act 1982. These are MPs presently sitting in the House of Commons. These are MLAs in the various provinces of Canada.
Wow.
I mean, and they thanked me like they were unbelievably grateful for me pointing out certain things. And some of them didn't even know some of that stuff was in the charter, right?
Well, Brian, we're count ourselves very fortunate to have you open for us that part of our history that has been so neglected and which is being so ignored by politicians and the courts. And thank you again for your stalwart, courageous stance over the past few years. And thank you for bringing this case to the court, even though the court has basically abstained from doing their duty. They've turned a blind eye and a deaf ear to this just cause. But thank you for bringing it anyway.
And my last point, Rob, which I think is very important for people would say, well, why did you go all the way to the Supreme Court? If you lost the federal court, you lost the federal court of appeal. And my point to the lawyers was this: we have to exhaust all the avenues so that it can never be said that the highest court in the land never had an opportunity to decide this case. Right. That's why we brought it. I mean, I was pretty convinced, based upon the federal court decision and the federal court of appeal decision, we were going to lose. But it was important to put on the record the Supreme Court of Canada's decision. And their decision is, we are cowards and we will not even hear it. But that was important. So now I can rest easy that nobody can ever say to me, oh, you stopped halfway through. You didn't really take it all the way. So we don't know what the Supreme Court of Canada really would have done. Well, now they know.
Well, we always talk about, because of many of the terrible things going on in our country, abortion, killing 100,000 babies a year, those types of things, the destruction of the younger generation through a lot of confusion that's being pushed on them. And when our great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren look back, we hope that they will know that we did everything we could to resist this, terrible destruction of our society. And maybe in God's good time, we will see a turnaround. And that's one thing that the Supreme Court needs to remember. They may have ignored the supremacy of God in their rulings, but one day they will stand before the Supreme Judge, who is really supreme. They are just an organization appointed by government, but there is a judge they will face, as all of us will, and we hope that
Precisely.
that realization will bring some clarity to them at moments of deep consideration of issues like this.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. The
Yeah.
final arbiter will have his or her say, or its say at the end of the day.
Yeah, very good. So, folks, don't forget to visit Brian Peckford's blog. It's Peckford42, Peckford number 4, number 2, .wordpress.com. And you will find a lot of good information there, information that supports many of the things that we've been talking over the past couple of years. And we're glad that we are not alone. We have fellow soldiers in the trenches with us. And Brian, we're thankful that you're one of those.
And all the best to you, to the Christian Heritage Party in your pursuit provincially and nationally. And I'll be looking forward to seeing some of your material and some of your points of view on all of that, because I have to very seriously consider whether I'm going to vote at all. And if I do, then who I'm going to vote for. And it can't be for any of the established parties.
Yeah. Well, I'll send you some information, and
Yep.
We're looking for a candidate in your area. So
Yes, and I was just going to ask if you got a candidate in our area or not.
Not yet, but I don't know. I don't suppose you're too eager to put on the hat again.
No, I wish I was, because, but no, I've reached a point where, but the last campaign I did federally, I mean, I was knocking hundreds of doors, my wife involved, and it was quite a taxing experience. Besides all I've gone through in the last 4 years with the COVID stuff and my court case, and still not knowing how much I'm going to have to pay on all of this. And so the best I can do is things like this right now. What I will, if in fact you do get a candidate, please let me know.
Yeah, and if you think of somebody in your area,
Yes.
or any of our listeners think of someone in your area who would make a good candidate, standing up for truth and justice and freedom, we would love.
I will so.
Well, love to hear from you. All right, okay. Brian, thank you so much. God bless you and all you do, and we'll look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you kindly for your invitation, sir.